A veteran Navy SEAL and his dog stopped to help an old woman on a quiet forest road. They thought it was just an accident. Just another moment they could walk away from. But hidden inside her old print shop was a truth she had lived without for decades. A letter never sent. A son she believed had betrayed her, and a past that was never what it seemed. As the truth slowly came back to life, so did something Silas thought he had buried forever. Because sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought in war, but in the choices we didn't understand in time. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Veteran Dog Stories. Silas Wren had learned a long time ago that roads didn't ask questions. They didn't care where you came from. They didn't care what you left behind. They simply stretched forward, mile after mile, like a quiet agreement between a man and his own silence. At 43, Silas moved through the northern edges of the United States like something half-forgotten. Tall, broad-shouldered, carrying the hardened frame of a man trained to survive things most people never saw. His face was all angles and restraint, a defined jawline shadowed by short, uneven stubble. His blue-gray eyes were the kind that didn't rest. They studied, measured, and remembered too much. His hair was cropped short in a practical military cut, dark brown with early streaks of silver at the temples. He wore the same clothes everywhere he went. An olive field jacket worn soft at the elbows, dark cargo pants, a red and deep blue plaid shirt underneath, and weathered brown leather boots that had seen more ground than most people ever would. A faded military watch clung to his wrist, ticking with stubborn loyalty. He didn't stay anywhere long enough to unpack. The only constant was the dog. Rook moved beside him like a shadow that breathed. A German Shepherd K9, 5, maybe 6 years old, with a disciplined, athletic build. Black and tan coat, short and dense, muscles shifting beneath it with quiet precision. His amber eyes were always alert, always calculating, watching the world not as it appeared, but as it might become. Rook didn't bark without reason, didn't move without intention. And when he stopped, Silas stopped too. They had walked through places together where the air smelled of smoke and metal and endings. Places Silas never talked about. Places Rook never forgot. And yet, there was one memory Silas carried that had nothing to do with war. He had missed his grandmother's last breath. Missed it because he was somewhere else. Because orders had come first. Because he had believed there would always be time later. There wasn't. And since that day, Silas had learned something else about roads. If you never stayed, you never had to be late again. That afternoon, the forest felt unusually bright. Northern light filtered through tall pines, scattering across the narrow road in thin golden bands. The air held that early autumn chill, the kind that didn't bite yet, but promised it would soon. Silas drove an old truck that rattled more than it should. Rook sat upright in the passenger seat, still as carved wood, eyes scanning the tree line. Then, without warning, Rook moved. Not a bark, not a growl. Just a shift. His body tensed, his ears lifted, and in the next second, he leaned forward and pressed his weight toward the dashboard, blocking Silas's view just enough to force his attention. Silas slowed. "Yeah, I feel it too," he muttered, though he didn't know what it was. Rook wasn't looking ahead. He was looking right, into the trees. Silas pulled the truck to the side of the road. They listened. Nothing. Just wind brushing branches, a distant bird, the ordinary sounds of a world that didn't need them. Then Rook jumped down. He didn't run. He walked, slow, deliberate steps into the brush. Silas followed. 20 yards in, the ground dipped slightly. And there it was. A pickup truck angled awkwardly into a shallow ditch. Front wheel caught against a buried root. The windshield cracked like a spider web. One door half open. Silas's pulse shifted. Not panic, not fear, just a controlled rise in awareness. He approached carefully. Inside, behind the wheel, sat a woman, older, 70, maybe more, thin but not fragile. Her gray-white hair was tied loosely at the back, strands falling free around a weathered face lined with years that had not been easy, but had not broken her either. There was dried blood at her temple, a shallow cut, and her left arm rested awkwardly against her lap. Her eyes were open, clear, alert. "I was beginning to think," she said calmly, voice dry but steady, "that I might be here until the deer started asking questions." Silas blinked once. Then, almost imperceptibly, the corner of his mouth twitched. "Let's not give them the chance." Her name was Elspeth Vale. 76, she said, as if the number mattered less than the fact she could still say it without hesitation. Up close, Silas noticed her hands. Thin, veins visible beneath pale skin, fingers slightly trembling at rest. But when she moved them, even injured, they were precise, intentional. Hands that had done careful work for a long time. "I was on my way back," she explained as he checked her arm, stabilizing it with practiced efficiency. "Picked up supplies, wood glue, replacement hinges. The back door's been threatening to leave for weeks." "You drive out here alone often?" Silas asked. "Of course," she said. "If I waited for someone else, nothing in that house would ever get fixed." There was no self-pity in her voice, only fact. Rook stood beside the open door, watching her. Not wary, not defensive. Just present, Elspeth noticed. "Well now," she murmured softly, "aren't you a serious one?" Rook didn't move, but his tail gave one slow, deliberate sweep. The hospital was small, local. Mara Bell met them at the entrance, a woman in her mid-30s, practical build, chestnut hair tied back loosely, wearing a moss-green parka over her scrubs. Her face carried that quiet competence of someone used to solving problems before people realized they had them. "What happened?" she asked, already moving toward Elspeth. "Tree root ambushed me," Elspeth replied dryly. Mara gave her a look. "Of course it did." She turned to Silas. "You bring her in?" He nodded once. Mara studied him briefly, taking in the posture, the stillness, the way he stood like a man who always knew where the exits were. "Thank you," she said simply. "Most people don't stop on that road." Silas didn't answer, because most people didn't have Rook. As Mara wheeled Elspeth inside, Rook suddenly stiffened again. Not outside this time, inside the building. His head turned sharply toward the corridor leading deeper into the hospital. Low, focused, still. Silas noticed immediately. "What is it?" he whispered. Rook didn't bark, didn't move forward. He just stood there, staring at something Silas couldn't see. For a long second, the world felt tilted, like a memory just out of reach. Then, Rook blinked. The tension left his body, and he walked calmly after Elspeth. Silas stayed still for a moment longer. Something about that felt familiar. Too familiar. The injuries weren't severe. A mild concussion, a sprained wrist, bruising. Mara insisted Elspeth stay overnight. Elspeth refused. "I've got plants that don't believe in hospitals," she said, "and a door that's one gust away from retirement." Mara sighed, already knowing she'd lost. "You'll at least let someone drive you home?" Elspeth glanced at Silas. Silas didn't hesitate. "I'll take her." The house sat at the edge of the forest, where the trees began to thin and the land opened just enough to hold something human. It wasn't large. A single-story wooden structure, paint faded, porch slightly uneven, vines curling lazily along one side. It had once been cared for, meticulously. That much was clear. but time had begun to press its weight into every corner. Behind it, partially hidden by trees, stood a smaller building, older, quiet, closed. Elspeth noticed Silas looking. "That's the shop," she said. "Hasn't been worth much in years, but it refuses to fall down. Stubborn thing." Silas nodded. He understood stubborn things. He helped her inside, set her bag down, checked the hinges on the back door out of habit. Rook moved through the space slowly, mapping it, memorizing it. No threats, no tension. Just quiet. Too quiet. Elspeth settled into a worn chair near the window. "You've done enough," she said. "You should get back to whatever road you came from." Silas stood there for a moment. He knew she was right. This was the part where he left, where he nodded, said something brief, walked out, and never came back. That was how it always worked. But when he turned toward the door, Rook didn't follow. The dog stood near the hallway looking, not at Silas, but deeper into the house. Still, waiting. Silas exhaled slowly. "You staying?" he muttered. Rook didn't move. Silas looked back at Elspeth, at the worn edges of the room, at the quiet weight of a place that had outlived too many voices. And something inside him hesitated. For the first time in years. The road behind him felt easier than the step forward. Silas Wren, a man who had never struggled to leave, didn't move. The house didn't collapse all at once. It yielded in small ways. The porch sagged just enough to creak when stepped on. The back door leaned slightly in its frame, like it had grown tired of holding its position. One corner of the roof dipped where years of snow had pressed too hard, too often, without anyone strong enough left to push back. Silas noticed these things the way he noticed everything. Quietly, without comment. By morning he had already begun. He worked without asking. A loose plank on the porch was tightened first, his movements efficient, almost mechanical, but not careless. His hands were rough, calloused, built for force, but they adjusted pressure instinctively, like he knew exactly how much was enough. Elspeth watched him from the doorway. Wrapped in her gray cardigan, her thin frame leaning slightly against the doorframe, she looked smaller in daylight, but not weaker. Her pale blue eyes followed his hands, not his face. "You measure before you move," she said after a while. Silas didn't look up. "Habit. Or discipline," she corrected. That made him pause, just briefly. Then, he went back to work. The garden had once been carefully planned. You could see it beneath the chaos. Rows that used to be straight, beds that once held purpose. Now, wild grass pushed through everything, reclaiming it inch by inch. Silas cleared slowly, not ripping, not rushing. Rook stayed close to Elspeth, always within a few steps, his presence calm and grounded. The German shepherd moved with quiet authority, his black and tan coat catching the morning light, his sharp eyes scanning every corner of the yard. Every now and then, Elspeth would reach down and rest her hand on his head. "You don't hover," she murmured once, almost to herself. "You stay." Rook didn't react, but his tail shifted, once. Silas heard it, and something in his chest tightened in a way he didn't appreciate. They worked through the afternoon. The back door hinges were replaced, the latch reinforced, a section of the fence straightened and secured. Silas moved like a man who didn't need instruction, but who also didn't assume ownership. Every change he made, he checked with a glance toward Elspeth. Every time, she nodded. Not approving, acknowledging. There was a difference. Inside, the house carried a stillness that wasn't empty. It was layered. Photographs lined the walls, old ones, black and white. Some faded to soft gray, One caught Silas's attention. A man stood beside a printing press, sleeves rolled, posture relaxed. Not tall, not imposing, but steady. There was ink on his hands. Even in the photograph, you could almost see it. "That's my husband," Elspeth said from behind him. Silas turned slightly. "He built the shop?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, he kept it alive." There was something in her voice that made Silas not ask more. Not yet. They ate a simple dinner, soup, bread, nothing elaborate. Elspeth didn't cook much, that was clear. The kitchen was functional, not lived in. Silas sat across from her, quiet as always. Rook lay near the doorway, but his eyes remained open. Always open. "You don't stay long anywhere," Elspeth said suddenly. It wasn't a question. Silas took a moment before answering. "No." "Why?" He looked down at his hands. "They don't need me to." Elspeth watched him carefully. Then she nodded once, like she understood something deeper than what he said. "Or maybe," she said softly, "you leave before they can." Silas didn't respond, but he didn't deny it either. Later, as the sun dipped behind the trees, they stepped outside. The air cooled quickly. From the back of the house, the small outbuilding stood in shadow. The print shop. Silas had seen it earlier, but hadn't stepped inside. Now, Elspeth walked toward it slowly. Her steps were careful, measured, not weak, just deliberate. She reached the door and paused, her hand resting on the handle. "For years," she said quietly. "I told myself I'd fix it when I had time." She gave a faint, almost amused breath. "Turns out, time doesn't fix things. It just waits." She pushed the door open. The smell hit first. Dust, old wood, and something else. Faint, but unmistakable. Ink. Silas stepped inside. The room was frozen in another era. A long wooden table, metal tools, rows of shallow drawers lining one wall, and at the center, a printing press, heavy, iron, silent. Rook entered last and stopped. The dog's body changed. Not fear, not aggression, recognition. Rook moved forward slowly, each step precise, until he reached the press. Then he sat, perfectly still, his eyes fixed on it. Silas frowned. "What is it?" he murmured. Rook didn't move, didn't blink, just watched the machine, like it was something alive. For a moment the room felt different, heavier, like something unseen had shifted. Silas stepped closer to the press, and for no reason he could explain. He felt like he had just walked into a place that had been waiting. Elspeth noticed. "You feel it too," she said. Silas didn't answer. Because he didn't have words for it, she moved past him toward the drawers. Her fingers brushed across the wooden handles, lightly, like she was greeting old friends. "This place used to speak," she said. Not loudly, but clearly. She pulled open one drawer. Inside, rows of small metal blocks, each resting in its own compartment. Type. Silas stepped closer. He picked one up, turned it in his fingers. The letter was backward. But somehow, he understood it. Not the word, just the idea. That it meant something. "Elspeth," he said slowly, "how do you read this?" She smiled faintly. "You don't read it the way it looks," she said. "You read it the way it will become." Silas held the piece of type a moment longer, then set it back carefully, like it mattered. They stayed there longer than expected. Not working, not fixing, just standing. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It had weight, history, presence. When they stepped back outside, the light had faded. The forest had grown darker, shadows stretching longer between the trees. Silas looked at the house, at the broken edges, the unfinished repairs, at the shop behind it. Then at Elspeth. "You've been handling all this alone?" he asked. "For a long time," she said simply. Silas nodded. He knew what that felt like. That night, he stood by the truck. His bag was still in the back. Everything he owned in one place. It would be easy. Drive away, find another road, another job, another place that didn't ask anything from him. That was the deal he had made with himself years ago. Rook stood beside him, waiting. Silas opened the truck door, then paused. He looked back. At the house, at the faint light still glowing in the window, at the outline of the old shop behind it. And then at Rook. "You're not ready to go," he said quietly. Rook didn't move, didn't look away. Silas exhaled slowly, closed the truck door. "All right," he muttered. Not a promise, not a decision, just a delay. But for a man like Silas Wren, that was the first step towards staying. The mornings came quieter now. Not because the world had changed, but because Silas had stopped rushing through it. He woke early, as always. That hadn't changed. Years of training had carved that rhythm too deep into his bones. But instead of packing up and checking his route, he stepped outside with a cup of black coffee and stood on the porch, listening. Wind through pine, wood settling under the weight of time. The soft shift of Rook's paws behind him. The house no longer felt like a temporary stop. It felt like something holding its breath. They worked in the shop by mid-morning. Elspeth moved slower than before, her injured wrist wrapped in a simple cloth brace. But her hands, those careful, practiced hands, still knew exactly where to go. She didn't explain things the way teachers did. She demonstrated. Silas watched, then repeated. "Not like that," she said, not unkindly, as he picked up a piece of type. Her voice carried a quiet authority, the kind that came from years of doing something correctly without ever needing to prove it. "You're gripping it like it might fight back." Silas glanced at the small metal letter between his fingers. "I've handled worse." "That's the problem," she said. He looked up. Elspeth met his eyes, calm and unwavering. "This doesn't need strength," she continued. "It needs trust." Silas didn't respond, but he adjusted his grip. The composing stick felt foreign at first, a narrow tool of wood and metal, deceptively simple. It didn't demand speed, it demanded attention. Each letter had to be placed backward, each space measured without measuring. There was no room for distraction, which made it harder than anything Silas had done in years, because silence gave his mind space, and space brought memory. Rook lay in his usual spot near the edge of the room, 5 feet from the press, always the same place, always facing inward. The German shepherd's body remained still, but his ears tracked everything. The faint scrape of metal, the soft breath of Elspeth shifting her stance, the subtle hesitation in Silas's movements. He didn't sleep. He observed, like a soldier off duty, but never fully at rest. By afternoon, Silas had managed to set a full line. Not perfect, but close. Elspeth leaned in, her eyes scanning the reverse text. "There," she said, tapping lightly. "Too tight." Silas adjusted. "Again," she said. He reset the spacing. She nodded once. "Better?" Silas leaned back slightly. "That's it?" Elspeth allowed herself the faintest smile. "That's everything." They worked in stretches, short bursts of focus, followed by silence. Sometimes Elspeth spoke, about the shop, about her husband, about the kind of work they used to do. Wedding invitations, church bulletins, announcements that mattered deeply to people no one else remembered. "There was a time," she said once, "when people waited for paper the way they now wait for screens." Silas glanced at her. "And now?" She shrugged lightly. "Now they wait for things that don't last." The light shifted slowly through the window, casting long shadows across the rows of typed drawers. Dust moved in the air, visible only when caught in the right angle. The room didn't feel abandoned anymore. It felt paused, like a sentence waiting to be finished. Late in the day, as Silas reached for a piece of type from one of the lower drawers, Rook moved, not sharply, not urgently, but deliberately. He stood, walked across the room, and stopped beside Silas. Then, without warning, he placed his paw lightly against the wooden drawer. Not scratching, not pushing, just resting there. Silas froze. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Rook didn't look at him. His gaze stayed fixed on the drawer. Elspeth turned slowly. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition. "That one," she said softly. Silas looked at her. "What about it?" Elspeth took a step closer. Her fingers hovered just above the drawer's edge, but didn't touch. "That drawer hasn't been opened in years." Silas frowned. "Why not?" Elspeth's expression shifted, something distant passing through it. "I don't remember deciding not to," she said. "I just stopped." Silas glanced down at Rook. The dog's paw remained exactly where it was. Still, certain. And for the first time, Silas felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not danger, not fear, but the quiet pull of something unfinished. He didn't open it. Not yet. Something told him this wasn't a moment to rush. Evening settled slowly. They moved away from the drawers, back toward the press. Elspeth guided him through the next steps. Ink, pressure, alignment. Each action required precision, but also patience. Silas adjusted the plate, locked the form in place, and hesitated. Elspeth watched him. "You're waiting," she said. Silas nodded slightly. "For what?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "For it to feel right." Elspeth's expression softened. "It won't," she said. "Not the first time." Silas exhaled quietly. Then he pulled the lever. The press moved with resistance. Old, but not broken. The sound was low, mechanical, like something waking up slowly after a long sleep. The paper pressed against the inked type. For a brief moment, everything stilled. Then Silas lifted the sheet. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. The letters were clean, sharp, alive. Not just marks on paper, but something intentional, something real. Silas held the page closer to the light. His eyes traced the line, backward in creation, forward in result. For a second, he wasn't in the shop anymore. He was somewhere else. A kitchen, a small table, an older woman guiding his hands. No. He blinked. The memory slipped, but the feeling stayed. Elspeth watched him carefully. "What do you see?" she asked. Silas lowered the page slowly. "Something I should have learned a long time ago." Elspeth didn't press. She didn't need to. Rook returned to his spot, settled again, watching, waiting. Night came quietly, the kind of night that didn't demand attention, just existed around you. Silas stepped outside again. The air had cooled further, stars beginning to show between the branches. He leaned against the porch post, listened. For the first time in years, his thoughts weren't racing ahead. They were staying. Inside, the shop remained open, light still glowing faintly through the window. A machine that had not moved in years had turned again. A line of words had been set, printed, held. Silas looked back at the house, at the faint outline of the shop behind it, at the life still quietly trying to continue, then down at Rook, who had come to stand beside him again. "You knew?" Silas said softly. Rook didn't respond. He never did. But his presence was answer enough. Silas exhaled slowly, not leaving, not deciding, just not walking away. And for a man who had built his life on movement, that was enough. For now. The next morning didn't feel like the others. Not because anything had changed on the surface. The same pale light filtered through the trees, the same slow creak of wood shifting under the house. But because something beneath it all had shifted. Silas felt it before he could name it. He stepped into the print shop earlier than usual. The air inside still carried that faint, stubborn scent of ink and dust. It clung to the room like memory, refusing to disappear, no matter how long it had been ignored. Rook followed. But this time, he didn't settle into his usual place. He walked straight toward the lower row of drawers, and stopped. Silas didn't say anything at first. He had learned that with Rook, words were often unnecessary. The dog stood there, his body relaxed but focused, his gaze fixed. Not intense, not aggressive, just certain. Silas crouched beside him. "You've been coming back to this one," he said quietly. Rook didn't move. The drawer was like the others at a glance. Same wood, same worn handle, same thin layer of dust. But once Silas pulled it open, the difference was immediate. The bottom sat too high, not by much. Just enough that something inside Silas, something trained to notice the smallest irregularities, refused to ignore it. He ran his fingers along the inner edge. Smooth. Too smooth. "This isn't right," he murmured. Elspeth appeared in the doorway, leaning slightly on the frame. She hadn't made a sound, but she had heard enough. "You're seeing it now," she said softly. Silas glanced back at her. "You knew?" Elspeth shook her head slowly. "No," she said, "but I felt it." He removed the drawer completely and turned it over. The underside told a different story. 4 small brass screws, subtle, almost invisible beneath years of grime. Deliberate, careful, not original. Silas looked at Elspeth again. She didn't move closer, didn't stop him. But her eyes had changed. Not fear, something deeper. Recognition. Silas reached for a screwdriver from the workbench. The metal clicked softly as it met the first screw. Each turn felt louder than it should have, not because of the sound, but because of what it meant. Some things stayed buried for a reason. Some things waited. The last screw came loose. Silas lifted the thin wooden panel, and for a moment, no one breathed. Inside the shallow cavity, wrapped carefully in aged cloth, were 4 objects. Time had not erased them. It had preserved them. A leather-bound journal, a folded letter, sealed once, now brittle at the edges, a small metal box, and a sheet of paper, partially inked, unfinished. Silas didn't reach for them immediately. He looked at Elspeth. This wasn't his. Never had been. She stepped forward, slowly. Her movements were measured, but her hands, they weren't steady anymore. She stopped beside him. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, barely above a whisper, "I remember now." Silas didn't interrupt. "My husband," she continued, her voice distant, as if speaking through years rather than across a room, "used to keep things in places no one would think to look." Her eyes moved across the objects. "He said people only search where they expect answers." A faint, almost broken smile touched her lips. He never trusted expectation. She knelt beside the drawer. Her fingers hovered over the journal first, but didn't touch. Then the letter. Paused. And finally, the unfinished print. As Elspeth's hand moved closer, Rook stepped forward. Not abruptly, not forcefully, but enough. He placed himself gently between her and the drawer, not blocking, just present. Elspeth froze. Her hand hovered in the air. Silas watched carefully. "What is it?" he asked. Rook didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on the objects. Then slowly, he lowered his head, resting it lightly against Elspeth's wrist. The old woman's breath caught, not in fear, but in something far more fragile. Understanding. "He's telling me to wait," she whispered. Silas didn't argue, because deep down, he knew that was exactly what was happening. Elspeth withdrew her hand, not out of hesitation, but out of respect. "For all these years," she said quietly, "I thought the past had already taken everything it could from me." She looked at the hidden space. "I didn't realize it had left something behind." Silas carefully lifted the journal. The leather cracked slightly under his touch, dry but intact. He handed it to her. Elspeth took it slowly, like it carried weight beyond paper. The letter came next. Folded once. Sealed long ago. The seal was broken by time, not by hands. Silas noticed the edges. Worn, but never opened. Or opened only once. He couldn't tell. The metal box was heavier than it looked. Inside, when he opened it carefully, were a few old coins and something else. A ring, plain, worn smooth from years of being carried or held, not displayed, not forgotten, just kept. And then, the unfinished print. Silas picked it up last. The paper was thick, edged, but still strong. Ink marked the surface, clear, deliberate. But the sentence stopped halfway, as if the person who said it had been interrupted, or had stopped, knowing they wouldn't return. "What does it say?" Silas asked. Elspeth didn't answer immediately. She took the page, held it close. Her eyes moved slowly across the reversed text. Then, she closed them. For a long moment, the room fell into silence. Even the forest outside seemed to still. When she opened her eyes again, something had changed. Not broken, not healed, but shifted. "He was writing to our son," she said quietly. Silas felt something tighten in his chest. "Elspeth." She shook her head gently. "No," she said. "Not yet." Her voice was steady again, controlled. But there was a tremor beneath it, the kind that didn't come from weakness, but from something finally being seen. She placed the paper back down, carefully, like it might disappear if she moved too quickly. "We don't rush this," she said. Silas nodded. He understood that too. Some things weren't meant to be opened all at once. Rook stepped back, the space between them and the drawer cleared. But the feeling didn't. The room was no longer just a place. It was a threshold. Between what had been hidden and what was about to be understood. Silas stood slowly. His eyes lingered on the objects. Then on Elspeth. She hadn't touched the letter again, hadn't opened the journal, hadn't finished reading the page. "Why hide it?" Silas asked quietly. Elspeth didn't look at him. "Because he didn't know if I was ready to find it." Silas exhaled. That made sense. More than he wanted it to. They didn't speak much after that. There was nothing left to say. Not until something else was ready to be heard. As evening approached, Silas slid the drawer back into place. But not all the way. Not closed, not hidden. Just waiting. Outside, the light softened again. The forest exhaled. Silas stepped out onto the porch, Rook beside him. The same place as the night before, but nothing about it felt the same. "You did this," Silas said quietly. Rook didn't react. Didn't need to. Silas looked back toward the shop, at the window, at the faint outline of Elspeth moving inside. And for the first time, he understood something clearly. This wasn't just a place he had stopped. This was a place he had been led to. And whatever waited inside that drawer wasn't finished yet. Morning did not arrive gently that day. It came with a kind of stillness that felt earned, or perhaps borrowed from something that had already been broken. Silas woke before sunrise, as always. But he didn't step outside this time. He sat at the edge of the narrow bed in the small guest room, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the worn wooden floor as if it might give him an answer. It didn't. Some things never did. Across the house he could hear movement. Slow, uneven. Elspeth was awake. When he entered the kitchen, she was already there. Seated at the small table by the window, wrapped in her gray cardigan, her posture slightly bent but steady. A cup of tea rested untouched in front of her. Her face had changed. Not in a way that weakened her, but in a way that made something invisible visible. There are moments when a person's entire understanding of their life shifts quietly beneath them. When memory rearranges itself, when meaning changes shape. Silas had seen that look before, on men, on women, on himself. Elspeth lifted her eyes to him. "They weren't his words," she said. Silas didn't ask what she meant. He knew. The letter lay open on the table. The paper was old, edges brittle, but the ink still clear. Written in a careful, deliberate hand, one that had measured every word before committing it. Elspeth touched it lightly. "He never wrote like this," she said. "Not to me. Not to anyone." Silas leaned against the doorframe. "Then why this one?" Elspeth's lips pressed together. "Because it wasn't meant for me." She took a slow breath. "My husband? He wasn't a man who explained himself. Not fully. Not easily." She paused, choosing her words the way one might handle fragile glass. "He believed that if something could be carried quietly, it should be." Silas's jaw tightened slightly. He understood that kind of man. Too well. "He made a mistake," Elspeth continued. "Years ago, with the shop." Her fingers curled faintly against the table. "Alone, a bad decision. He thought he could keep the place afloat long enough to fix it." She shook her head slowly. "But things didn't turn out that way." Silas didn't interrupt. The silence gave her room. "Our son found out," she said. Her voice softened, not in weakness, but in distance. He stepped in, took responsibility, signed things he shouldn't have, said things that made it look like it was his doing. Silas exhaled quietly. "And you believed it?" Elspeth nodded. "I did." The words didn't come with tears. Not yet. They came with something else. Weight. The kind that settles slowly, over years, until it becomes part of how you breathe. "He left after that," she said. "We argued. I said things." Her voice caught briefly. "Things a mother should never say." Silas looked away. Not because he didn't want to see, but because he knew what that kind of memory felt like when it surfaced. "The letter," she continued, gesturing toward the page, "was written after he left." Silas stepped closer. "Your husband wrote it?" "Yes." "But never sent it?" She shook her head. "No." Her eyes drifted toward the shop. "He must have planned to finish it, to print it, to send it properly." A faint, broken breath escaped her. "But he didn't." Silas followed her gaze. to the unfinished print, still resting where they had left it. That was his way, she said softly. He believed words meant more when they were made, not just written. Silas glanced down at his hands, at the faint traces of ink that hadn't quite washed away. And now? He asked. Elspeth didn't answer right away. She reached for the unfinished print, held it carefully, like it might still carry the warmth of the hands that had started it. Rook, who had been lying quietly near the doorway, stood without warning. Not sharply, not urgently, but with purpose. He walked across the room and stopped beside Elspeth. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his head toward the print in her hands and let out a low, almost inaudible sound. Not a growl, not a whine. Something in between. Silas felt it immediately, that shift, that subtle change in the air that Rook had recognized before. "What is it?" Silas asked, his voice low. Rook didn't look at him. He stayed focused on the paper. Then he sat, straight, still, like he was waiting. Elspeth's fingers tightened slightly around the page. Her eyes moved again across the incomplete sentence. This time, slower, more deliberate, as if seeing something she hadn't noticed before. "There's more," she whispered. Silas frowned. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer. Not directly. Instead, she turned the page slightly toward the light. The angle changed. The shadows shifted. And for a brief moment, the faintest impression of additional ink became visible. Not printed. Pressed. As if something had been set, but never fully transferred. Silas stepped closer. "You see that?" Elspeth nodded slowly. "He didn't stop writing," she said. "He just didn't finish printing." The room grew quieter. Not empty, but focused. Elspeth lowered the paper. Her hands were no longer trembling. They were steady. Not because the pain was gone, but because something inside her had settled into place. "I misunderstood him," she said. Not to Silas, not to anyone. Just out loud. Silas didn't offer comfort, didn't offer reassurance. Some things couldn't be softened. They could only be faced. "You still can't fix it," he said quietly. Elspeth looked at him. Her expression didn't break. "No," she said. "But I can stop being wrong about it." That was enough. For now, the rest of the day moved differently. Slower. More deliberate. They didn't return to repairs. Didn't clean. Didn't fix anything. Instead, they sat in the shop. The journal open between them. Pages filled with careful handwriting. Records, notes. Fragments of a life that had continued, quietly, even when no one was looking. Silas read in silence. Names of customers, orders, dates. But between the lines, something else. Thoughts that hadn't been meant to be seen. "He kept everything," Silas said. Elspeth nodded. He didn't believe in letting things disappear. Silas closed the journal gently. He understood that, too. By evening, the light had softened again. The forest outside seemed unchanged. But the house, the shop, felt different. Not lighter, but clearer. Elspeth stood slowly, her movements still careful. But there was something new in them. Not strength, not yet, but direction. She looked at the unfinished print one more time, then at Silas. "He started something," she said. Silas met her gaze. "And didn't finish it." She nodded. "And now, it's here." Silas exhaled slowly. He didn't need to ask what she was thinking. Rook moved to the doorway, sat, watching both of them, as if waiting for something to be decided. Silas looked at the press, at the type, at the page, then back at Elspeth. "You're not done with it," he said. It wasn't a question. Elspeth's lips curved, just slightly. "No," she said. Outside, the sky darkened. Inside, the story had changed. Not because the past had been erased, but because it had finally been seen for what it was. The press did not come back to life easily. It resisted. Not violently, not dramatically. Just enough to remind anyone who touched it that time had passed, and it had not been kind. Silas stood over it in the early morning light. Sleeves rolled, hands darkened with old grease and new effort. The Chandler and Price press sat at the center of the shop like a stubborn animal that had chosen to lie down and forget how to stand. He understood that kind of stubbornness. He had lived inside it. "Not force," Elspeth said from her chair near the window. Her wrist was still wrapped, but she held herself differently now. More upright, more present. There was something steadier in her voice. "It's alignment." Silas adjusted the flywheel again. "Feels like both," he muttered. Elspeth allowed a faint smile. "That's because you're still thinking like a man who solves problems by overpowering them." Silas didn't respond, but he eased his grip. Days passed like this, slow, deliberate, measured not by hours, but by progress. A hinge replaced, a spring retensioned, a gear cleaned, oiled, turned, then turned again. Silas worked without complaint, without expectation. But there was something different in him now. He wasn't just fixing something. He was listening. To the machine, to Elspeth, to the quiet spaces in between. Rook remained constant, always near the press, always positioned where he could see both the door and the workbench, his body at ease, but never careless. At times he would stand and circle once, then return to the exact same spot, as if recalibrating something only he understood. Silas noticed. He always noticed. By the fourth day, the press moved freely. Not perfectly, but enough. Silas wiped his hands on a rag and stepped back. "That's as far as I can take it without running it," he said. Elspeth nodded. "Then we run it." They didn't rush. The type had to be set first, properly. Silas stood at the composing stick again. The unfinished sentence lay beside him, incomplete, waiting. He picked up the first letter, placed it, then the next, and the next, each one reversed, each one intentional. He didn't ask what the full sentence was supposed to be. Elspeth didn't tell him, not yet. Some things had to be earned through the act itself. Midway through the line, Silas paused. His hand hovered over the type case. His jaw tightened slightly. "What happens if I get it wrong?" he asked. Elspeth didn't look up from where she sat. "Then you correct it," she said simply. Silas let out a slow breath. "And if it's too late to correct?" That made her lift her eyes. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then you learn how to live with the version that exists," she said quietly. The words settled between them. Not heavy, but permanent. Rook stood. Without warning, his ears lifted, not toward the press, not toward the house, but toward the road. Silas froze. The shift was immediate. Instinct. Recognition. A moment later, they heard it. An engine. Low, controlled, approaching. Silas moved toward the door. Rook was already there. Still. Watching. A dark SUV came into view, tires crunching slowly over gravel. It stopped just beyond the fence. The engine cut. The silence that followed felt deliberate. The driver stepped out. Gideon Hale, mid-40s, tall, lean, his posture straight, movements economical. Dark hair, neatly styled, touched with early silver at the temples. His face was composed, sharp lines, clean-shaven, the kind of expression that rarely changed because it never needed to. He wore a charcoal coat that fit too well to be accidental, over a dark, high-collared shirt. Everything about him suggested control, not just over himself, but over situations. He closed the car door gently, then looked toward the house, then the shop, then Silas. "Mr. Wren," Gideon said calmly, as if he had been expected. Silas didn't move. "Don't think we've met," he replied. Gideon's gaze flicked briefly to Rook. "Your reputation travels faster than you do." That wasn't a compliment. Elspeth stepped into the doorway behind Silas. "You're early," she said. Gideon inclined his head slightly. "I prefer clarity before things become complicated." Silas didn't like the tone, didn't like the way the man stood, too comfortable, too certain. "What do you want?" Silas asked. Gideon reached into his coat and pulled out a thin folder. Documents. He didn't open it. Didn't need to. "I represent a group interested in this property," he said. Elspeth's expression didn't change. "I've heard." Gideon nodded once. "Then you also understand the position you're in." Silas's eyes narrowed slightly. "What position is that?" Gideon turned his attention to him fully now, measured, evaluating. The one where the past becomes financially unsustainable. Silas stepped forward. Just enough. Rook shifted with him. Not aggressive, but unmistakably present. "You're talking in circles," Silas said. "Say what you mean." Gideon did not react. "This land," he said evenly, "is tied to debts, old ones, poorly managed ones, legal structures that no longer favor sentiment." He glanced briefly at the shop. "Unless certain arrangements are made, ownership will be reevaluated." Elspeth stepped forward now, not fast, not forceful, but steady. "I'm not selling," she said. Gideon's gaze returned to her. "I'm not asking you to." That was worse. Silas felt it. That quiet pressure, not immediate, but inevitable. Gideon closed the folder. "I'll return in a week," he said. Then he looked at Silas again. "And I suggest you decide whether you're involved or simply passing through." He turned, walked back to the SUV, drove away. Silence settled again. But it wasn't the same silence. Silas stood there for a long moment, then exhaled. "That your husband's debt?" he asked quietly. Elspeth didn't answer directly, but her eyes said enough. Silas nodded once. He had seen this before. Different form, same pressure. He turned back toward the shop, toward the press, toward the unfinished line. "I can walk away," he said. Not to Elspeth, not to Rook, just out loud. The words hung there. Real, possible. Rook didn't move, didn't look at him, but stayed exactly where he was. Silas ran a hand across his face, then stepped back inside. He picked up the composing stick again, set the next letter, then the next. Elspeth watched him, didn't speak, didn't thank him, because she understood something important. If he stayed, it had to be his choice. The line came together slowly, piece by piece, a sentence rebuilt from fragments, from truth, from things left unsaid. Silas locked the form into place, positioned it in the press. His hands didn't shake, but they weren't as steady as before. He paused, just once, then he pulled the lever. The press moved. Stronger now, cleaner, alive. Paper met ink, pressure met form. When he lifted the sheet, the sentence was complete. Silas stared at it, not reading, not yet, just seeing it. Because it wasn't just ink. It was a message that had waited over 20 years to exist. He looked at Elspeth. Her eyes were fixed on the page. Silas understood something then. Not about the machine, not about the debt, not even about the past, but about himself. There were things in this world that didn't need saving. They needed finishing. And for the first time in a long time, Silas Wren knew exactly which kind of man he was standing there as. The shop did not reopen with a sign. No banners, no announcements, no grand declaration that something lost had been found again. It simply opened its door. The first morning felt almost ordinary. Silas unlocked the door, the metal key turning with a quiet click that seemed louder than it should have. He stepped aside, letting the cool northern air slip into the room, brushing lightly across the ink-stained surfaces, the worn wooden drawers, the iron frame of the press that now stood ready. Rook entered first, as always. The German shepherd paused just inside the threshold, his body still, his gaze sweeping the room with calm precision. His ears flicked once, catching the faint sounds of the outside world. But there was no tension in him, only awareness. Then he moved to his usual place and lay down. Elspeth arrived a few minutes later. She walked slower than before, but her posture had changed. Not straighter, not stronger, but more anchored. Her gray cardigan hung loosely over her shoulders, sleeves slightly rolled back. The lines on her face hadn't softened, but they no longer looked like they were carrying the same weight. She stepped inside and stopped. Not because something was wrong, but because something was right. For the first time in years, the shop did not feel like a memory. It felt like a present. "You opened it early," she said quietly. Silas glanced at her. "Figured it should be ready if someone shows up." Elspeth gave a faint, almost amused breath. "And if no one does?" Silas shrugged lightly. Then it was still worth opening. They didn't speak much after that. There wasn't a need to. The space held its own language now. The first visitor came just before noon. A woman in her early 30s, practical in both posture and presence. Mara Bell. She stood at the doorway for a moment before stepping inside, her moss-green parka unzipped, revealing a simple gray sweater underneath. Her dark brown hair was tied loosely at the back, a few strands escaping around her face. Her expression was curious, but not surprised. She took in the room slowly. The press, the drawers, the faint scent of ink. "You actually did it," she said. Silas leaned against the workbench. "It wasn't just me." Mara nodded, glancing toward Elspeth. "I didn't think it would ever open again." Elspeth's lips curved slightly. "Neither did I." Mara stepped closer to the press, her fingers brushing lightly across the edge of the table. "My father used to bring me to a place like this," she said. "Different town, same smell." She smiled faintly. "I remember thinking the machines were alive." Silas glanced at the press. "They are," he said quietly. Mara looked at him, considering that. Then she nodded once. "Yeah," she said. "I guess they are." The second visitor arrived not long after. An older man, maybe in his late 60s, thin, slightly stooped, with a face lined deeply by time but softened by a kind of quiet kindness. He introduced himself simply as Harold Pike. He wore a faded brown jacket that had been patched more than once, and carried a small wooden box in both hands. "I heard," he said, glancing around the shop. "Didn't believe it at first." Elspeth stepped forward. "Most people didn't." Harold gave a small nod. "I used to run deliveries for your husband," he said. "Back when this place was still working." His voice carried something fragile, not regret, but remembrance. He set the wooden box on the table, opened it carefully. Inside were small tins of ink, old but sealed. "I kept these," he said. "Didn't know why." He looked at Elspeth. "Now I do." She didn't thank him, not with words. She simply placed her hand over his for a moment. And that was enough. The third visitor came quietly. A child, no more than 8 years old. A boy with messy blonde hair and wide eyes that didn't know how to hide curiosity. He lingered at the doorway, half hidden behind the frame, watching. Silas noticed him first. "You coming in?" he asked. The boy hesitated, then stepped inside slowly. His name was Evan. He didn't say much. Didn't need to. His eyes said everything. "What does it do?" Evan asked, pointing at the press. Silas glanced at Elspeth. She nodded. So he stepped forward, showed him, carefully, deliberately. Evan watched every movement, every adjustment, every turn of the lever, as if he were trying to memorize it all at once. When the paper came out, he didn't speak. He just stared at it, then looked up. "That's real," he said. Silas almost smiled. "Yeah," he said. "It is." As Evan reached out to touch the freshly printed sheet, Rook stood, not abruptly, but with purpose. The room shifted, subtle but undeniable. Rook walked toward the doorway, stopped, and looked out. Not at anything visible, but at something approaching. Silas followed his gaze. The road beyond the trees remained empty, silent. But Rook did not move. He remained there, watching, waiting. Elspeth noticed too. Her expression didn't change, but her hand rested lightly against the edge of the table. "Sometimes," she said quietly, almost to herself, "things take longer to arrive, even when they've already started moving." Rook finally turned away, returned to his place, lay down. The moment passed, but it didn't disappear. By late afternoon, the shop had settled into a rhythm, not busy, not crowded, but alive. Elspeth sat at the table, the paper in front of her blank. For a long time, she didn't write, didn't move. Then, she picked up the pen. Silas didn't watch directly, but he noticed the way her shoulders shifted, the way her breathing changed. This wasn't just writing. This was choosing. She wrote slowly, carefully, each word placed with the same precision she had taught him. No rush, no hesitation. When she finished, she didn't read it again. She folded the paper, placed it beside the press. "Will you set it?" she asked. Silas looked at her, then at the paper, then back at her. He nodded. The process took time, more than before. Because this wasn't practice. This wasn't learning. This mattered. Each letter was placed with intention, each space measured, each line aligned. When it was ready, Silas stepped back, looked at Elspeth. She gave a small nod. He pulled the lever. The press moved smoothly now. No hesitation, no resistance. Paper met ink. And when he lifted the sheet, the words were no longer hidden, no longer waiting. Elspeth took it in both hands, held it carefully, as if it might disappear if she wasn't steady. She didn't read it out loud. She didn't need to. Outside, the light began to fade. Silas stepped out onto the porch again. Rook followed. The forest stretched out before them, unchanged, endless. But something inside him was no longer moving. He looked back at the house, at the shop, at the faint glow of light from inside. He didn't say he would stay, didn't make a promise. He just didn't leave. And for a man who had built his life on leaving, that was everything. Rook lay down beside the door. Calm, certain, as if he had known all along. This was never a road meant to be followed. It was a place meant to be found. Sometimes, the greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder or light. They come quietly, like a road that makes you stop when you were meant to keep going. Like a stranger who feels familiar. Like a second chance hidden inside something you thought was already over. God doesn't always change our lives in an instant. Sometimes, He leads us step by step, through places we never planned to be, through people we didn't expect to meet, until one day we realize we are exactly where we are meant to be. In our everyday lives, we all carry unfinished stories. Words we didn't say, people we lost touch with, moments we wish we could go back and fix. But maybe the miracle isn't going back. Maybe the miracle is being given the chance to finish what was left undone, in a new way, at the right time. If this story touched your heart, take a moment today to reach out to someone, to stay a little longer where you would normally walk away, or to listen to that quiet voice inside you that says, "This matters." Share this story with someone who might need hope. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what part of this story spoke to you. And don't forget to subscribe to Veteran Dog Stories so we can continue bringing you stories that remind us what truly matters. May God watch over you, guide your steps, and bring peace to your heart. May He open doors you didn't know existed and place the right people in your path at the right time. And may you always find your way exactly where you are meant to be.